If we have achieved half of the number of people living into poverty, we can now really irreversibly eradicate that poverty, as I talked about. The SDGs that were developed is really meant to be an answer to that. The SDGs are global goals. The MDGs were basically for the emerging markets. Poverty now is a global issue. Even in the United States, 70 million people living below the poverty line. 17 goals have been established and 169 targets. It sounds like a lot.
I think they've got the right one.
They got the right one now. Why don't we look at the not going halfway for 1 second, and we'll pick it up from there. Let's have a look. If ever you have a chance today to look at this only going halfway, we might have that. It's a 1 minute film, but hopefully we can show it at the end of my talk. What I want to really talk about is what we should do about it, which is far more important. Here we have the 169 targets, the 17 global goals. What can we do to make them come alive? At the end of the day, it's not about all these agreements that we sign, but it's actually about us starting to deliver. The biggest challenge we have is the challenge immediately at hand, which is climate change. In fact, the Canadian philosopher Hubert Reeves said it very well. He said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And we're well on our way to do this. It was already 50 years ago that John F. Kennedy said that man has it in his mortal hands to eradicate poverty if they decided to do so. I also believe, like your previous speakers, that we don't need any more PhDs in this world. We don't need anybody anymore going to Mars to find the answer. Most of the things that need to be done to solve the burning issues that we have can be done today with the knowledge that we have. It is as simple as that. Now, for that to happen, you have to go to goal number 17 above all, which is the goal of partnership. You know all the goals that are there. 17 is actually the most important one. Our system has come so far in trying to address all of these issues, but despite, with a lot of goodwill, having addressed all of these issues, we still live in a world where about 800 million people go to bed hungry, not even knowing if they wake up the next day. We still live in a world where about 2.5 billion people don't have access to clean water or sanitation. We still live in a world that a big part of the population, especially the female and young girl part, are excluded from the economic processes. There are major challenges that need to be addressed. And these challenges cannot be addressed by business as usual. It was Einstein who said the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It doesn't work. We have to work differently together. We have to work in partnership. We have to make models for the longer term to address these issues that certainly can be addressed on a quarterly basis. And we have to do this with a focus on what I call the common good. If we continue to focus on ourselves and our own interests, we will not get there. The challenge that we have on a political level is that the world increasingly has become interdependent. Our financial systems, climate change going from one part of the world to another part, the international trade, the internet and technology, we have become very interdependent. But the reality is our political system simply hasn't adjusted to that. Most of the global political system that we use to talk about these issues were developed in 1948 at the time of what they called Bretton Woods. The OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization to some extent, even the Security Council of the UN. If it doesn't represent the changing world that has happened over the last 50, 60 years, it's difficult to solve these issues. So there is a responsibility for all of us to get into that partnership. Our people told me yesterday that only 10% of you believed that governments would come with a decent climate change agreement in Paris in December. I was disappointed to hear that, I have to honestly tell you. It's right to be a skeptic. But how many of you vote? How many of you have written to your elected officials in your parts of the world? How many of you have made fundamental changes in the way you live to attack climate change? How many of you have started a movement bigger than yourselves in the interest of the common good to do more than just the little thing like I recycle or I turn off the lights when I go out of my house? Is it really right to put such a burden on politicians alone and say they will not make it anyway and be self-defeatist about it? 10% is 10%. I actually am a little bit more optimistic than you are. I think the world is seeing a fundamental change. Some of us don't want to see it. Then you have the answer. If you want to be part of that change, we can move it much faster than we've ever done before. In my company, which I don't want to talk too much about, we decided to put a business model out there of totally decoupling growth from environmental impact. We think that's possible. Obviously, you need to do it first in your own shop. Earn the right to be at the table. We cut our carbon emission by 65% since 1995. All of our factories are waste-free. Then you can work in your value chain. Very important. How do you get your suppliers to be sustainably sourced? How do you ensure that these forest fires or deforestation stops? How do you bring in good agricultural management? You work your value chain. A company like ours has 75,000 suppliers. An enormous impact that you can have by leveraging that. The third thing then you do is work on more transformative changes. One of the reasons I'm in the region is indeed to be in Indonesia as of Monday, to talk with all the stakeholders to see what we can do following the recent disasters of climate change, which is the enormous fires that you've seen in that part of the world. Transformative changes happen in the consumer goods industry when they all go together and say, let's attack the issue of food waste. If food waste was a country, it would be the biggest carbon emitter after China and the US. Third biggest carbon emitter in the world, because 30 to 40% of food is wasted. Forming coalitions with governments, civil society and businesses to attack that, you can make a big difference. I have no doubts about that. For Paris, it's actually an interesting process. I know it took us 21 times meeting to get there. That's why it's called the COP21. But this one is different. This one started out by simply asking the countries, what are you willing to do? For the first time, we have a bottom-up agreement. Looks a little bit more empowering to me. Some countries came in with something challenging, other countries a little bit greenwashing, somewhere in between. But at the end, we have a document from 161 countries. The 161 countries together are saying more or less in Paris that we can reduce by about 30% right now. That's a good first agreement. There is no way, as we do need to manage this climate change and stay below the 2 degrees, between now and the end of the century, there is no way that you will get a 100% game plan already on the first day. But if we have an agreement of 30%, it's the first time that we have 161 countries signing that. It's the first time that we have an agreement on a 30% reduction, which, by the way, is 4 times more than the Kyoto Protocol. If at the same time we get from Paris a commitment to put a price on carbon, you treasure what you measure. If the politicians can agree to renegotiate every 5 years and not come back on their previous agreements, and if we can find a decent mechanism on financing, which is this famous 100 billion climate fund that needs to be established as of 2020 every year to help the poorer countries convert, then I think we have one of the best agreements in the world. But it needs all of us to make that happen. And the world is changing at a rapid rate to support this. There is the science imperative. More scientists than ever say that we have a problem. In fact, about 97% of them. If in this climate disaster there is one endangered species, it's actually the climate doubter himself. There is a science imperative. There is a technology imperative. You've all heard about Moore's Law. Moore's Law is applying on steroids to the way we're moving to sustainable energy. The price of solar has come down by a factor of 1,000% over the last 30 years alone, and the same for wind power. Even with the low prices of oil that we have now in this world, many places already have cheaper alternative fuel. In fact, this is the first time in history that we have more investments in alternative fuel than in fossil fuel. It's starting to be a tipping point. Also more people employed, by the way. That's a technology imperative. The financial market, if we like them or not, they're getting involved. $24 trillion of financial capital is calling for a price on carbon. Increasingly, the financial market is de-risking their portfolio as well on carbon. If you don't believe me, look at the market cap of Tesla, selling 80,000, 90,000 cars a year, versus the market cap of General Motors, selling 9 million cars a year. Tesla is only half the market cap of General Motors by selling only 80,000, 90,000 cars versus the 9 million cars. Fossil fuel companies certainly have not seen their stock prices move up in the last decade. It's actually the opposite. And increasingly the investors, with big movements at universities in many places in the world, are divesting their portfolios from carbon. Since we have the internet, we're able to measure everything. The return from companies that manage carbon responsibly, that publish their carbon exposure, is also better for shareholders. Not surprisingly, because these are companies that are more transparent, take risks out. If you take risks out, you have a lower cost of capital and most likely a higher return. That's the financial imperative. Then you have the citizens' imperative. Never ever have we seen such a broad movement of people in the streets with their actions all across the world to demand that business is done differently. And business needs to be done differently. Why am I protecting, in this case, the politicians a little bit? Business is 60% of the global economy, 80% of the financial flow, and 90% of the job creation. It is very difficult to expect our politicians to have all the answers. We need to work together. Business needs to change at the same time. Partnerships of different dimensions need to be solved. When we do that, I have no doubt that we can get a good agreement in Paris and a starting point to create a brighter future for all, including for those yet to come. Let's use the rest of the time for Q&As. Did you find that song?
I'll get people to the mics.